Hello, I'm Anavultus, and here with my co-host.
Why Berckenhoff, everybody? Thank you. No, the Why
Yeah,
Berckenhoff are the breakdown with WB. Thank you for having me.
yeah. Today we are coming back once again on getting the answers, and today's topic is a topic that's a little bit of a follow-up on a previous topic. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the trial of King Charles I, and we had mentioned a particular document that we thought may have been an influence on that king, and that document was written by his father, and it is a treatise called The True Law of Free Monarchies, or the Reciproc and Mutual Duty Betwixt a Free King and His Natural Subjects. So that is the topic of discussion today.
Yes, for sure. And as you previously mentioned, there's a couple of topics that we basically discussed on the trial just a little bit, but I think we can get much more specific here because he does mention them in this paper or in this essay, depending on what you want to call it. So I think we'll get into a much philosophical, maybe deeper conversation compared to last week.
Yes, and of course, this was written by King James the Sixth of Scotland and First of England. I believe this was written while he was still only King of Scotland before he rose to the thrones of England and Ireland. And of course, the perennial pretense to France that the kings of England had as well at that time.
Right, right. I don't know exactly when he wrote this, so I'm not able to confirm or deny that. But that does sound right from yeah, it does sound right. So
Yeah, because he particularly addresses Scottish politics in it. So anyway, I would like to read the preface to it before we begin. If you have any particular section you want me to read, I can happily read it. I know that the language is a bit antiquated, so it's a bit difficult for a lot of people to read quickly. However, uh, I have read it a bit, so I can read it quite well. And I can do some live modernization to some degree on the text. But anyway, I will read the preface, an advertisement to the reader, as it is titled there. Accept, I pray you, my dear countrymen, as thankfully this pamphlet that I offer unto you, as lovingly it is written for your wellness. I would be loath both to be fascious and fectless, and therefore, if it be not sentious, at least it is short. It may be that you miss many things that you look for in it, but for excuse thereof, consider rightly that I only lay down herein the true grounds to teach you the right way without wasting time upon refuting the adversaries. And yet I trust, if you will take the narrow tent, you shall find most of their great guns paid home again, either with contrary conclusions or tacit objections. Suppose in a darned form and indirectly, for my intention is to instruct and not to irritate, if I may eschew it. The profit I would wish you to make of it is as well so to frame all your actions accordingly to these grounds, as may confirm you in the course of honest and obedient subjects to your king in all times coming, as also that ye shall fall in purpose with any that shall praise or excuse the bypast rebellions that break forth either in this country or in any other. You shall herewith be armed against the siren songs, laying their particular examples to the square of these grounds, whereby you shall soundly keep the course of righteous judgment, discerning wisely of every action only according to the quality thereof, and not according to your prejudged conceits of the committers. So shall you by reaping profit to yourselves turn my pain into pleasure. But lest the whole pamphlet run out of the gaping mouth of this preface, if it were any more enlarged, I end with committing you to God and me to your charitable censures. So that's the preface to the pamphlet, or treatise, as he calls it in a different point. What do you think of it?
Right. I would just want to say one quick thing, and then I'll get into what I think. I think it's important to note that James the First was known to be kind of a scholar thinker and more philosophical thinking about topics. So I think in a large part that's why he did write this. I just think that that would be also important to mention. I mean, kings in general always tended to write a lot, especially in that time period, but he seemed to talk more about specific things compared to the average king in that time period. So
Yes,
now what I think
I
of,
think one of his
no,
interests is the political philosophy, but I think it's important to note that he does mention God in the preface, and he mentions God a lot more in the main text. So it also has a strong theological element throughout it.
right, right. Now, as far as what I think of the preface or the introduction, I think that honestly, it's a really good introduction because it does show what he thinks are. Let me rephrase that. It shows what is going to be in the rest of the text, and it also is telling you right away that it's going to be short and it's going to be simple. So a lot of people, even back then, I could probably say this for certainty, didn't necessarily want to read more than they had to if they didn't need to, type of thing. That's kind of human nature. Now you could argue that we've gotten lazier since we got more resources now, but that's a whole separate argument. But I think that that's good to state because it lets people know and lets people kind of value what each of the words are if it's a lot shorter.
Yeah. And I think another thing to note is that he's writing in a way that he's not being confrontational with his adversaries. He's saying that the points he's going to make, he's not going to try to directly make them as a refutation to his adversaries. He's going to present his position, and that within his position, there will be likely a refutation of his adversaries, but that's not the main point of his writing. But he also makes it very clear that he is concerned about potential rebellions to his rule as a king, and that is an important motivation for him when writing this.
Right, right. Which I think it's important to understand motivations. I think that kind of goes without saying. Uh, yeah, I think that's very important to understand when learning about text, especially text in this way.
Yeah, and of course the English. It was also written in Scots in the late 16th century, so the language is a bit antiquated to a lot of people, but I think that a lot of the vocabulary should be familiar if you can look through the spelling of it, because it's spelled different. The sentences might be structured slightly differently from the norm today, but I think it's still understandable to someone that at least has a decent knowledge of English literature.
It may take a few reads, but it's
Yeah,
not rocket science.
yeah. So he also, when he actually begins in the text, he sort of lays out what the structure of his argument is going to be. So he So there's a couple of opening paragraphs that I would like to read at the beginning of the text, and then we can talk more broadly about different sections of a text and different points that he makes.
Right. Just like a high school essay, you got to lay out your points.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. As there is not a thing so necessary to be known by the people of any land next to the knowledge of their God, as the right knowledge of their allegiance according to the form of government established among them, especially in a monarchy, which form of government, as resembling the divinity, approacheth nearest to perfection, as all the learned and wise men from the beginning have agreed upon, unity being the perfection of all things. So hath the ignorance, and which is worse, the seduced opinion of a multitude blinded them, who think themselves able to teach and instruct the ignorance, procured their wreck and overthrow of sundry flourishing commonwealths, and heaped heavy calamities, threatening utter destruction upon others, and the smiling success that unlawful rebellions have oftentimes had against princes in ages past, such hath been the misery and iniquity of the time, hath by way of practice strengthened many in their error, albeit there cannot be a more deceivable argument than to judge by the justness of a cause by the event the justness of their cause by the event thereof, as hereafter shall be proved more at length, and among others, no commonwealth that ever hath been since the beginning hath had greater need of the true knowledge of this ground than this our so long disordered and distracted commonwealth hath, and misknowledge hereof being the only spring from whence have flowed so many endless calamities, miseries, and confusions, as is better felt by many than the cause thereof well known and deeply considered. The natural zeal, therefore, that I bear to this my native country, which the great pity I have to see the so long disturbance thereof for lack of the true knowledge of this ground, as I have said before, have compelled me at last to break silence, to discharge my conscience to you, my dear countrymen, herein, that knowing the ground from whence these your many endless troubles have proceeded, as well as you have already too long tasted the bitter fruits thereof, you may by knowledge and eschewing the cause escape and divert the lamentable effects that ever necessarily flow thereupon. I have chosen then only to set down in this short treatise the true grounds of a mutual duty and allegiance betwixt a free and absolute monarch and his people, not to trouble your patience with answering the contrary positions, which some have not been ashamed to set down in writing, to the poisoning of infinite number of simple souls, and their own perpetual and well-deserved infamy, for by answering them I could not have eschewed, whilst to pick and bite well saltly their persons, which would rather have bred contentiousness among the readers as they had liked or misliked, than sound instruction of the truth, which I protest to him that is the searcher of all hearts, is the only mark that I shoot at herein. First, then, I will set down the true grounds whereupon I am to build out of the scriptures, since monarchy is the true pattern of divinity, as I have already said. Next, from the fundamental laws of our own kingdom, which nearest must concern us. Thirdly, from the law of nature, by diverse similitudes drawn out of the same, and will conclude since by answering the most weighty and appearing incommodities that can be objected. So there we have it. He the first paragraph lays out his general purpose. The second paragraph is a bit of a roadmap for the structure that the treatise takes. So one thing that I think is very important to note is that he describes a misunderstanding of a relationship between a ruler and his subjects to be the only cause of various negative events. That is, he considers it to be, perhaps if you were to press him on it, he might say, well, there's obviously other reasons, but that he considers people's misunderstanding of the king, his authority, and their relationship as subjects to be the chief cause of many problems, not only in Scotland, but also in various other countries. I think that that's something that's important to note that he's saying there.
Right, right. And also, he doesn't seem to. You mentioned this before, but I think you can see it a little bit more in this next paragraph as well. But his language has gotten not necessarily more attack or accusatory necessarily, but it definitely has an undertone of simply saying like, look, you need to focus more on let's say history here, or focus on these points. And you don't, when you read over this, I'm not threatening you, I'm not doing that, but I'm saying like, look, what I'm going to explain is going to clearly show you that the points I have here are justified, and if that's what you're going to go away and take. So it's not necessarily threatening language per se, but you can kind of read a little bit into it as him saying, like, there's an undertone, I think is the best way of putting that. And the other thing that I thought he seemed to talk about in an introduction and probably going to talk about in more points was stableness. And I think he mentioned that several times, and I believe he's gonna. Oh, I know he's gonna show that in some of his points because he brought it up. But also, I think that he's trying to show, like through history and through my expectations, what you should seek as people who I rule. You should seek stableness and not seek riots and not seek overruling the king, because that only leads to bad results.
Yes, although he does mention that he isn't going to use purely the exact results to be the full judgment of all of these events. I think, let me look at the statement he makes on this. Because he does make a statement where he wants to discuss. There it is. Then to judge I the justness of the cause by the event thereof. So he isn't going to say that necessarily just because an event happens that might be positive, that means that it is necessarily just. So he isn't making a, you could say, pragmatic or utilitarian argument here. Now he does in the second paragraph mention that there's three types of argument that he is making, and those types are, of course, the theological argument that he's going to make from the scriptures, and he says that the monarchy is the true pattern of divinity, which means he's comparing the way a monarchy operates to how the process or the effectiveness of godhood works. That is, that to him, the way a monarchy works in a similar way to the way God rules the world. And the second point, he talks about the laws of his own kingdom, which is Scotland. So he's making a legal argument. And the third point is a more natural argument where he makes similitudes and discusses various things from a different perspective than the theological and legal perspective there.
Right, and I think the reason he has it structured that way is that's okay. Let me ask this question, and you can say if you agree with this or not. But usually, when you write an essay or write a paper, write a point, you structure your points by how you value them. Now, there's different strategies you can do. Sometimes people want to start with their weakest point and then end with their strongest point, but usually it's the other way around. Usually people want to start with their strongest point and hopefully draw in the reader, and once the reader is invested, they'll end up finishing your weakest point, and hopefully your weakest point is good so that they finish it. That's the whole concept. Do you think that he structured it in the way where it's the strongest to the weakest and what he valued?
Well, judging by the fact that he begins the first paragraph saying that the knowledge of a monarchy is second to the knowledge of God, and then he begins his first argument as a theological argument in the second paragraph, I would say that it is ordered likely from what he considers to be the strongest or the most relevant argument to perhaps the least relevant argument, but that is still supporting to his cause. I think that
Right.
is, I would agree that it is structured in that way.
Right, and I think that leads into his belief in divine rights as a king. And we kind of talked about that with Charles the First. That was last week, I think.
Two weeks ago.
Time 2 weeks ago. Okay, that's time's all over the place for me. Anyway, so we get the divine rights being the concept that either you view yourself as a god or you view yourself as God has given you the rights to be king. In other words, God has chosen you to be the king. And I think that James the First also believed in that concept, and that also explains why he probably had that as his first point.
Yes, I would say that this treatise does, in a number of ways, confirm a position of the divine right of kings, and that is to say that monarchs rule through the assent of God, and that therefore God is the proper judge of a monarch rather than an inferior entity. That which would be on the opposing view, which is the contractarian view, which views kingship as a social contract between the king, in this case James, and the people, in this case the people of Scotland, or perhaps a more aristocratic viewpoint where it's the king and the peers of a realm, the lords, so to say, the lieges, as he describes them.
Right. Further down in that same section, you see them making references to Samuel, which is which is the Bible story of Samuel. I think most people, even if you aren't religious, probably know of Samuel and his stories. So he makes references to Samuel. A little bit further down, I think, is a part that interests me, where it starts with first, and I don't know if you want me to read it or you can read it if you found that after Samuel and execution of this commandment of
Yeah, well,
God.
we'll get to that.
Oh, we'll get to that. Okay.
I think one thing that's important to note is that rather than immediately going into the argument for his authority as a king, he begins by putting forward a number of different verses of the Bible in the fourth paragraph, where he discusses what a king is, and then he gives the a breakdown of the coronation of a king, and therefore he actually rather than going into the exact process and authority of the king first, he actually goes into the duties of the king to his subjects. So I would like to read the segment here. And therefore, in the coronation of our own kings, as well as of every Christian monarch, they give their oath, first to maintain the religion presently professed within their country according to their laws, whereby it is established, and to punish all those that should press to alter or disturb the profession thereof, and next to maintain all the lovable and good laws made by their predecessors, to see them put in execution, and break the violators thereof to be punished according to, and the breakers and violators thereof to be punished according to the tenor of the same, and lastly to maintain the whole country and every state therein in all their ancient privileges and liberties, as well against all foreign enemies as among themselves, and shortly to procure the wellness and flourishing of his people, not only to maintaining and putting to execution the old lovable laws of the country, and by establishing of new, as necessity and evil manners will require, but by all other means possible to foresee and prevent all dangers that are likely to fall upon them, and to maintain concord, wealth, and civility among them, as a loving father and careful watchman, caring for them more than for himself, knowing himself to be ordained for them, and they not for him, and therefore accountable to the great God who placed him as his lieutenant over them, upon the peril of his soul, to procure the wellness of both souls and bodies, as far as in him lieth, of all them that are committed to his charge. And this oath in the coronation is the clearest civil and fundamental law whereby the king's office is properly defined. And then he goes on in another paragraph to discuss how the king is a father to his people and to his lieges from the coronation, and that therefore he has a applied to him in the similitude of the law of nature, a responsibility to his lieges and to his people, as is to their children, from parents to children, that is. And the paragraph ends with, and shortly as the father's chief joy ought to be in procuring his children's welfare, rejoicing in their wellness, sorrowing in their, and pitying at their evil, to hazard for their safety, travel for their rest, and wake for their sleep, and in a word, to think that his earthly felicity and life standeth and liveth more in them nor in himself, so ought a good prince think of his people. So the reason why I think this is important to emphasize is that he explicitly states that a king has these responsibilities to his people. And I think this is important if before we go into the part about Samuel, because the part with Samuel then goes to discuss the responsibilities of the people to the king, and therefore the argument, this is half of the argument, because it is described, as the title says, reciprocal, a relationship where that is going both ways, and where responsibility is handled both ways, although he then disputes the contractarian viewpoint that people have resulting from this.
Right. I think that's good to go back to this, as that makes a lot more sense. But it is interesting. Let's say it this way. It is interesting to think about, because usually when you think of a king that believes in divine rights, absolute monarchy, these type of concepts, they usually rule with say like an iron fist. They want to make sure everything's tight and they believe that their ruling is the way, and usually there's no give or take, to put it in those terms. But from reading the documents, from reading what he has to say, he almost, although he views himself as he's keen for a reason because God chose him, he still views himself living in God's image in a way, meaning that, excuse me, meaning that he sees himself as leader, yes, but he also sees himself as a father of the people, meaning that the father can still rule with, a strong stance, but he also can't rule with ignoring the people. So it's kind of interesting that he mentions that as well. So he seems to believe in both perspectives in that way.
Yeah, he what I would say his belief is that a king rules under God, and therefore from God and from his earthly relationships he has responsibilities to his people. However, he also views the people as not having the right from God to evict the king. So, in essence, he believes that if a king does something bad, he is accountable only to God and not to his people. And I think that that is the essence of the difference between divine right and of more contractarian or populist viewpoints. Another thing that I would point out that I would say is similar to another piece of literature that I have read is when he, a couple paragraphs back, when he goes through a number of different Bible quotes, he says, "Kings are called gods." And he's quoting Psalm 82, a psalm of David. And people have read this psalm and discussed it. But I think that this follows a sort of similar argumentation as I have seen in the work of John Jewell, a bishop who lived around this time as well, who some years earlier wrote an homily against disobedience and willful rebellion, which was put as additional literature to the Common Book of Prayer in England in the time of Queen Elizabeth, which discusses why it is wrong for people, theologically wrong for people to rebel against their rulers, even in the case that their ruler should be a child, a woman, as is true in the case of Elizabeth, or even a tyrant. So he seems to take from that similar school of thought. Now, of course, it makes sense because they're on the same island. John Jewell was on the sides theologically opposing the vestments in the Church of England at the time, so probably leaning a bit more towards the Presbyterian side, which at this time had gained prominence in Scotland. And so we can see that sort of connection there, thought-wise, as people obviously, in those times, people did travel and literature was exchanged over different areas, and a lot of Scots knew English, and so the transference of information wasn't difficult, especially when at times things would be written in Latin, which was at the time known by a lot of noblemen. So we can see that this isn't a unique case. King James isn't coming up with this as a new idea. We see this as already an intellectual trend existing beforehand.
Right. He's expanding upon it, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so you wanted to talk about the part of Samuel.
Yes. I'm debating if we need to read the paragraph above to kind of bring context into what he says below about the Samuel starting with the giant paragraph, or if we could just go down
Well, I
to
already sort of
his points.
summarized the one that starts by law of nature, the king. I summarized that one. Which one
Okay.
were you thinking of reading?
Well, I wanted to start with where it says first God commanded Samuel to do two things. The one to grant people their suit, that starting with that one. But I think we could probably just go ahead and read that and we can explain the context
Okay,
around it.
go ahead.
Okay. First, God commanded Samuel to do two things. The one to grant people their suit in Eugene?
Giving.
Them giving. Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Giving them a king. The other to forewarn them what some kings will do into them, that they may not thereafter in their urging,
Grudging.
grudging, and murmuring, say what they shall feel the snares here for spoken. We would near.
Never.
Oh yeah, never, never had a king of God. In case when we uh cared him,
Craved.
craved. Oh yeah, user V's. Let me just remember that. Craved him. He had let us know how we would have been used by him, as now we been in
Find.
Indy find, but oh, overlate, and this is meant by these words. So that was the first part, and then he gets into what he means by that paragraph. But I just wanted to mention one thing before we get into that. Obviously, we already mentioned that he uses Samuel and he uses Bible verses and makes
Yeah.
references to God in the Bible. Most people probably know who Samuel is,
Yeah.
but I think him using Samuel has some importance here.
Yeah. What is this importance?
That's a good question. I would say okay. So how I view this is who Samuel is in the Bible is usually considered to be a wise person. I don't believe he was the wisest per se. Who was the king in that time with the baby situation?
The baby situation.
Yes,
Are you talking about Solomon?
Solomon. Yes, yes. So Solomon was considered to be the most wise in that time period. Samuel is different, obviously. Uh, okay.
Yeah.
Let me put it in this way. So I think he makes references to Samuel and an importance to him because and we're going to read later on when he gives more examples to this point. But I think that the reason he uses it is because the examples kind of match, in particular, who Samuel was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the importance of using Samuel here, and the passage he uses is before Israel had a king. So Samuel was a judge in Israel, and the people of Israel asked Samuel to give them a king, to anoint for them a king, and he eventually ends up anointing Saul to be the king of Israel, and later on he anoints David at a different point. But the passage he uses is when Samuel tells the people, he warns them that if they get a king, the king will demand certain things from them. He will demand their service. He will demand taxes. He will demand them to pay in goods. He will demand from them service in labor. He will demand that their sons will go to war for him, etc. And he tells them all the different burdens that they will have when they have a king. And the people hear this and they still say that they want a king. So then he gets Saul to be the king of Israel for them. And what I think is significant here is that this is, of course, he goes into an extensive exegesis and analysis of this part of 1 Samuel. But the interesting thing here is that it is a mirror to the previous segment where he talked about the king's responsibility to his subjects. So now he talks about the subjects' responsibilities to the king, and he uses Samuel as a biblical example as to what subjects should do to their king. Meanwhile, there are some other people that utilize the same passage to imply that kingship is a disadvantage and that people shouldn't have kings because of the warning that was given and because God was unhappy that they had asked him to give them a king, because it sounded as if they were saying that what God had given them was insufficient for them. Nevertheless, I would say to people taking that position that it is also worth noting that God did, in the passage, God did then allow them to have a king, and therefore it was not evil for them to have a king. And he even went on to anoint David to be king later. And it is this kingship that is used as a preface to the kingship of Jesus Christ. And therefore, I think the argument would be that it is not evil to have a king. And I think that this is a very important understanding for James's argument, because some people use the same passage to imply that it is a bad thing to have a king. Now, we could argue about which types of government are better than others, and whether there are abuses in certain governments. And I don't think that James would deny this type of argument, because he later on goes on to mention other countries. For example, he mentions Venice, which at the time was a republic ruled by an elected duke or doge, as people say. So he mentions other governments, and he's not saying that those governments are illegitimate and that kingship is the only right form of government, but he is saying that it follows the pattern of divinity. That is to say, he says that it's good because it is in the same way that David and in eternity Jesus Christ is eventually king. And I think that is one way in which he does say that monarchy is superior, although he's not saying that God doesn't appoint the rulers of non-monarchic countries and that rebellion in non-monarchic countries is a good thing. He's not saying that. And I think that that's something that's important to understand, is that while he is presenting his own position as being a better position, he is not trying to delegitimize the governments of other countries.
Right, right. He's taken in context of where he is right, and it is a that does make this make a little bit more sense as well, with what you said there. So that is interesting, and actually makes it fit a little bit better. But he breaks kind of into points later on, with points of justice, points of execution, points of I'm going down to up. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then
After the exegesis of Samuel, he moves on to various points in the Bible where he talks about Jeremiah talking about how people uh, should pray for the king of Babylon. He talks about Paul, who in Romans tells the Romans to obey their rulers, and he asserts that at the time this was Nero. I'd have to check again when people think Romans was written, whether it would have been Nero or Claudius, although I don't think that that would have made a difference to the point significantly. Now, the reason why it is significant to some people is because Nero was quite obviously a tyrant who did kill Christians, at least locally in Rome. And as such, to command obedience to such a person would be something that really puts home the point of how people should not rebel against the government. And a similar point was made in the homily written by John Jewel. So, in that sense, these are common arguments that are made towards this point. But I think that, in my view, I would say that the exegesis is pretty sound. I wouldn't say that he is stretching anything in particular, with perhaps the exception of datings of monarchs and minor details, I would say, is where problems really are. I wouldn't say that his main point, at least in the context of the points that he is making and the evidence he's giving, I don't think that his main point is a weak point. I think it's a pretty solid point.
Right. He seems to stress authority, being authority over the people, but also the people should have authority to authority figures. But he also, even in this part, stresses the factor that authority should be fair, but should be accurate to what you do. So when you go into like the judgment or justice category, it's kind of like almost, I kind of read it as almost like eye to eye. If you do something, we'll do something back, and the only way that's going to work is if it's just in what we do. In other words, there doesn't really seem to be a lot of give way in what he's saying, but it also doesn't necessarily seem to be unfair in also what he's saying.
Yeah. I think that one mistake that you could argue he makes is when he talks about the history of Scotland, because he makes the point that Scotland in the early Middle Ages, late antiquity, was scarcely inhabited, and the people that did inhabit it were a few barbarians. And then King Fergus comes over from Ireland and conquers all of Scotland, and therefore all of Scotland is the original possession of the king, and therefore any hoard that is found in Scotland, that is to say, buried treasure, because in olden days it was common practice in a lot of places when things went bad, people would bury their coins and come back to them because they didn't want to get robbed. So any hoards that are found in Scotland, and this is part of the legal argument that he's making now, so that the second leg of the argument, any coins that are found under Scottish law, any hoards that are found that are not the property of a particular person, immediately revert to the king as property. Any land that doesn't have inheritors reverts to the king. Any bastard, his property, unless he is re-enabled, reverts to the king. So legally speaking, I would say that the idea of the original property being the king's property is an argument that you could say. Now, from a perspective of feudalism, this also makes sense to some extent. However, I would say that the historical argument that he makes is actually an anachronistic one, because he's talking about Fergus, who was allegedly, and we don't have a lot of contemporary records for this, so it's actually pretty hard to nail down, allegedly a king, the king of Dulriada, which is a kingdom in the Hebrides, centered in sort of north eastern Ireland and the Hebrides and the western coast of Scotland. So Dulriada was a kingdom in the early to mid-Middle Ages in that period. Eventually, a lot of it was conquered by the Vikings. But Fergus is allegedly a king of that country. But the argument that he makes, which is likely sourced from his tutor, George Buchanan, who tutored him when he was young, but George actually had a different perspective from King James, and he wrote his own book that talks more on the idea of a social contract, a contractarian monarchy, which is opposed to King James's divine right monarchy. This historical perspective is questioned by a lot of historians today. First of all, because it sort of really undermines the position of the Picts in Scotland, who were the indigenous population, who actually, from the historical record, feature much more prominently. Also, in the time of the alleged time of Fergus, which is I think it's the late 5th century, they did not conquer Scotland, and Dulriada didn't really gain a dominance over Scotland, and eventually what was left of Dulriada in the Viking conquests united with the kingdom of the Picts to form Alba, or Scotland, as you might say. But this happened many centuries after the time of King Fergus, and the historical accounts that talk about King Fergus, about this, were centuries after him, and were about as distant from that time period as James was, when James was about 1,100 years different from Fergus. So, generally speaking, I would say that the historical argument there is, while it is based on what at the time was cutting-edge research and the national myth of Scotland, is nowadays considered much less likely to be true.
Yeah, I didn't really know any of those details, but I could see where that would be a downside to what he's saying. But it's more. Do you think it's more just a misunderstanding on behalf of James, or do you think it's more deliberate in what he did?
Well, I think it is an advantageous position, although it is based on the research of the time. So by George Buchanan, for example, who researched this. So this is the opinion of the scholars of the time. However, therefore, I can't really say that it is something that's too heavily biased. Now, of course, these people were living in Scotland, so it makes sense that they would want to help the legitimacy of the Kingdom of Scotland. But by downplaying the Picts in the process and upplaying an ancient king that people nowadays still aren't sure whether he actually existed, it is quite inaccurate in that sense.
Right, right.
But I wouldn't say that it is necessarily damning to his argument, because regardless of whether or not Fergus conquered Scotland and became the original owner of all of Scotland. In later years, Scotland did unify and become a kingdom wherein the laws that he is referring to existed. So, in that sense, whichever way you go, it still is a real state that he currently is in, even if he is off a bit on the historical analysis.
Right. His points are accurate, but his context may be a little gray.
Yeah.
Let's see. I was looking for
But he
one more
does
paragraph.
he does also talk about the relationship that the king has to the law, and I think this is important to emphasize here, because it gives the proper nuance here. And he says, as likewise, although I have said a good king will frame all his actions to be according to the law, yet is he not bound thereto, but of his good will, and for good example giving to his subjects. For as in the law of abstaining from eating of flesh in Lenten, the king will, for example's sake, make his own house to observe the law, yet no man will think he needs to take a license to eat flesh. And although by our laws the bearing and wearing of hagbutts and pistolets be forbidden, yet no man can find any fault in the king for causing his train use them in any raid upon the borderers, or other malefactors or rebellious subjects. So, as I have already said, a good king, although he be above the law, will subject and frame his actions thereto, for example's sake to his subjects, and of his own free will, but not as subject or bound thereto. So he is saying that the king is above the law, but that the king should voluntarily subject himself to the law, but that also the people should not have the power to force the king to subject himself to the law. And of course, in the case of his successor, King Charles, this eventually is the difference of opinion between him and the High Court of Justice that tried him for treason and other high crimes. But in this case, this is also an example of a legal doctrine that you would call sovereign immunity, which is to say that the sovereign of a country cannot be sued or tried by the law except of his own volition. And that is a doctrine that exists even in some more republican countries, and exists in a sort of halfway degree in the US, wherein if you are an elected official, you have immunity during your term from prosecution of certain crimes, for example. And that exists for the effectiveness of governance. Now, in the case of King James, it also existed as an affirmation of his sovereignty. And I think one thing that's pretty interesting about this is he talks about gun control. he talks about hagbutts or hackbutts, harquebuses, arquebuses, as you could call them, the long guns of the time, and pistolets. And he says how it's forbidden for people to wear them in public, but that the king, by his right as king, has the right to arm himself and his train for use of these weapons against various bandits in the countryside. So in that sense, he's saying that he is exempt from gun control in his country.
That is pretty funny, I have to admit. Going all the way back into to that far, we've got conversation on gun control.
Yeah, the true sovereign citizen.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I still think that James is an interesting mix. I kind of mentioned earlier the reasons why I think so, but it seems to me like there's a lot of thought process into his points, and it doesn't ultimately seem like he plans to be a tyrant, so to speak, but he does plan to rule with a stern fist, as and not necessarily let people walk over him.
Yeah. And later on, he goes on to talk about how he is a father to his country. He uses the Latin term pater patriae, and that's part of his natural argument that in the same way as he is the father of his subjects, he therefore has a similar responsibility as a father has over his children, and also a similar authority.
Right.
And he also compares himself to the head of a body, and therefore the head having the reasoning capabilities commands the body to move and to act, and no part of the body may harm the head without harming itself. And I think this is also somewhat similar to the common image that we see on the cover of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, where the the Leviathan is composed of the people of the country, with the face of it being the face of the king. And I think that this is a sort of similar comparison being made here.
Right.
But also you could say it's similar to the idea of the church in Christian theology as being the body of Christ, with Christ being the head. So he could
Right.
also
I was gonna
be
say.
alluding to that.
Right. I was gonna say because he is Catholic, although I've read somewhere that he started to become more
No,
Protestant. But
James is not
no.
a Catholic.
Oh, he wasn't. Okay.
No,
Misread that then.
James was raised in Scotland to be a Protestant monarch, and the Church of Scotland is a Presbyterian church. He also became the King of England later, and the Church of England is, of course, follows Episcopalian polity, but has some ceremonial sides that are more similar to the Roman Catholic side, and some theological elements that are more Protestant. And of course, there was a huge controversy between the High Church Anglicans and the Puritans in the time of King James. And as King James had said early on in the treatise, one of the king's duties is to uphold the religion of the country that he is over, and therefore he sided with, rather than siding with the Puritans, who were more similar to the Presbyterians of his home country. He actually tried to make a compromise between the Puritans and the already established Anglicans. And his son, King Charles, would actually move more towards the High Church Anglican side, much to the consternation of his Puritan subjects.
Right. So I was mistaken on that one, but because I was gonna say if he was, that would make sense that he could be mentioning the Eucharist in that. But there are other denominations that do use the Eucharist as well.
Well, yeah, the Church of
So
England, for example.
right. So he still could be mentioning that as kind of a symbol of what he's trying to say.
Yeah. But I think he gives a number of different arguments at different points. And he mentions a number of different things. I think one important terminology point here is the use of the term Commonwealth, which is used several times throughout this. A Commonwealth is something that is a common wealth, something that is the wealth held in common between people. And he uses that to refer to a country, particularly Scotland, but also other countries he calls commonwealths. And this is a common element in the literature of King James. And one thing that I think is important to understand is by calling them commonwealths, he actually does affirm not that it is his own personal exclusive possession. So he's not going into full 100% absolutism. He's actually emphasizing that the country exists as a benefit to its people when he uses the term Commonwealth.
There are debates over the practice of Commonwealth from I've heard before, uh, but I could see how he could use that particular example for what he's talking about. But I don't know too much about the idea of Commonwealth, but I have heard that there are debates on how best to practice it. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so he also moves on later to talk about wicked kings. So that is a king that abuses his authority. And he says here, whereunto for answer, I grant indeed that a wicked king is sent by God for a curse to his people and a plague for their sins, but that it is lawful to them to shake off that curse at their own hand, which, and when he says but, he is using that as a negation, as is commonly used in England. So he is subtracting the clause that it is lawful for them to shake off that curse at their own hand, which God hath laid upon them, that I deny. Okay, and so he denies that it is lawful to them to shake off the curse at their own hand, which God has laid on them, and may do so justly. Will any deny that the king of Babel was a curse to the people of God, as was plainly forspoken and threatened unto in the prophecy of their captivity? And what was Nero to the Christian church in his time, and yet Jeremy or Jeremiah and Paul, as you have also heard, commanded them not only to obey them, but heartily to pray for their welfare. So he is explicitly stating here that even if a king were to be a tyrant, that tyrant, even though he is negligent and contrary to his responsibilities as a king, still has the divine right of kings and therefore may not be overthrown by his subjects. And he uses a number of other paragraphs to say the same thing using different arguments.
Right. So you can say if this is right from my understanding of this point. In a way, he's saying that if you choose to overthrow the king or assassinate the king or anything relating to that topics or those topics, you're ultimately, for lack of better words, doing that to God.
Well, that is the exegesis that he would draw from Paul at Romans 13, I believe, where it talks about resisting people that resist the rulers receive damnation. I could look it up real quick if we like. So Romans 13, and John Jewell makes a similar argument.
Right.
So here we see Romans 13. I'm using Bible Gateway. I'm using the King James version because why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no God but of God. Sorry, there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So I think that is a point that he certainly agrees with, and I see a similar point made by John Jewell in his homily.
Which does make sense which does make sense because that kind of goes into to things we've already discussed in
Yeah.
today's episode
But
and kind of the concept of it as well.
but once
Go
again,
on.
I would emphasize that in saying this, he is also, because this passage doesn't specifically talk about monarchies, he is also granting that the same thing is true for non-monarchic governments. So he would say the same thing about a republic, for example.
Right,
Although he,
for the leader.
yeah, although he personally would disagree that it is a better form of government, he would not say that it is an illegitimate form of government.
Right, as we mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right.
But I would like, if we're going to read one more part, since we've gone on for some time, I would like to read the part where he talks about the social contract, which is the general counterposition to his own position, and he actually addresses it in a paragraph here. As to this contract alleged made at the coronation of a king, although I deny any such contract to be made then, especially containing such a clause irritant as they allege, yet I confess that a king at his coronation or at the entry of his kingdom willingly promiseth to his people to discharge honorably and truly the office given him by God over them, but presuming that thereafter he breaks his promise unto them never so inexcusable, the question is, who should be judge of the break giving unto them? This contract were made unto them never so sicker, according to their allegiance. I think no man that hath but the smallest entrance into the civil law will doubt that of all law, either civil or municipal of any nation, a contract cannot be thought broken by one party, or so the other likewise, to be free therefro, except that first a lawful trial and cognition be had by the ordinary judge of the breakers thereof, or else every man may be both party and judge in his own cause, which is absurd once to be thought. Now in this contract, I say, betwixt the king and his people, God is doubtless the only judge, both because to him only the king must make count of his administration, as is oft said before, as likewise by the oath in the coronation, God is made judge and revenger of the breakers, For in his presence as only judge of oaths, all oaths ought to be made. Then, since God is the only judge betwixt the two parties contractors, incognition and revenge must only appertain to him. It follows, therefore, of necessity that God must first give sentence upon the king that breaketh before the people can think themselves freed of their oath. What justice then is it that the party shall be both judge and party, usurping upon himself the office of God? May be this argument easily appear. May by this argument easily appear, and shall it lie in the hands of helpless multitude when they please to weary off subjection, to cast off the yoke of government that God hath laid upon them, to judge and punish whom by they should be judged and punished? And in that case, wherein by their violence they kive themselves to be most passionate parties, to use the offense of the ungracious judge or arbiter, nay, to speak truly of the case as it stands betwixt a king and his people, none of them ought to judge of the other's break. For considering rightly the two parties at the time of their mutual promise, the king is the one party, and the whole people in one body are the other party. And therefore, since it is certain that a king, in case so it should fall out that his people in one body had rebelled against him, he should not in that case, as thinking himself free of his promise and oath, become an utter enemy and practice the wreck of his whole people and native country, although he ought justly to punish the principal authors and bellows of that universal rebellion. How much less then ought the people that are always subject unto him and naked of all authority on their part press to judge and overthrow him? Otherwise the people, as the one party contractors, shall no sooner challenge the king as breaker, but he as so one shall judge them as breakers, as the victors, making the tiners and traitors, as our proverb is, the party shall I become judge and party in his own particular, as I have already said. So what the king is saying here is that if we assume, and he's making a hypothetical here, if we assume that the social contract is true, which he denies, then if the contract is broken, that under the civil law, there must be a judge of that contract who is also not party to that contract, and he considers that judge to be God, and that therefore the people may not unilaterally consider the contract to be broken, and therefore the people do not have a right to rebel against the king. Even if the king hypothetically were to break such a contract, because the people don't have the judicial power to decide whether the contract has been legally broken.
Right, because that would be the power of God.
Yeah. Just a moment, if you will.
While he's off, I guess we'll talk about the idea of this just a little bit. So he's going to get the paper there. There we go.
All right. I have brought to you a document here, the Declaration of Independence in Congress, July 4th, 1776. And in this document, I read, When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of a people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So, from the Declaration of Independence, we see the alternative to what King James has just written. That is, while King James writes a perspective of sovereignty where God is sovereign first, then the king, then the people, and if the people have a problem with the king, they need to bring it to the king, or they need to get a prophet from God to tell them to resolve the problem with the king. This says, the Declaration of Independence says that the king does not have that type of authority, and that his authority is derived from the people, therefore popular sovereignty. Now, it still mentions God as being sovereign overall, but it takes that different perspective. So that is the big difference here, and that is why it is important to research these things of King James and of Thomas Jefferson and of various other people, because it gets these different perspectives and different understandings of the legal theory here of sovereignty and of power and of the rights of the people.
Right. That is a very good point. I did like you're bringing a lot of things that I haven't really thought about today, so it's hard to bring up questions necessarily. But I'm drawing a blank. I guess I'll bring it back to this. So with King James' argument here with the social contract issue and the idea that God is the other side of the contract, right? And that's the only person that is the judge of the contract.
Well, no, he's not the other side of a contract. The contract is the people and the king.
Right.
Although James denies that this is a contract.
Right. Okay.
But he says that even if it were, that God would have to be the judge of this contract.
And not the other people.
Yes,
like
because he would say that it would be a misapplication of justice if the people were both party and judge in such a trial.
Right. Okay.
He's saying it's like putting the prosecutor to be also on the jury. That might be a comparison.
Right. I get that. I get that. Yes, but it brings me. So ultimately, it would come back to his belief that God is the judge of everything, right? And he's the only one that can judge. But then you have to ask, well, who judges the king? And he would argue once again that only God can judge the king.
Yeah.
But
and he also, I think it's important to emphasize, he does not deny that there can be bad kings, and he also does not deny that kings have a lot of responsibilities to their subjects. The legal point he's making is that even if the king fails in his responsibilities and becomes a tyrant, that it is not the right of the people, but only the right of God to overthrow him.
Okay. And ultimately, I think he would argue that if a king is tyrant, that God would be the ultimate judge, and he would get the penalty justified for it, and people probably couldn't really do that penalty. I think. Would you
Yeah.
say that that's a
Well,
fair statement, or?
in another paragraph, he talks about how the king being directly accountable to God is actually a much superior type of judgment, and that it means that he can be held to a much higher standard than the people could ever hold him. So in that sense, he makes it a bit different there.
Right.
So he is saying that this is actually a much higher standard than if the king were to be accountable to the people. But of course, this of course depends on people agreeing with his theological perspective. So anybody who's not a Christian or who takes a much different theological viewpoint would have a reason to disagree that what the king is saying about his accountability is true.
For sure, for sure. Because he's putting his judgment and what he does with God in his image, right? With him thinking of God. So obviously, if you're someone who's not religious, you're not going to like that perspective. And yeah, I mean that makes total sense.
Yeah, especially if you consider, for example, some of the founders of the United States were not as religious as the king here, and some of them were deists, Unitarians, some of them atheists. Although many of them were religious people, let me be very clear on that. But among those, that more diverse viewpoint, to come into an agreement, they would not be able to agree with King James's argument here, because it affirms God's revelation in the scriptures and his revelation through the Holy Spirit and exegesis and theological concepts that they might consider unwarranted. And therefore, it makes sense that someone like Thomas Jefferson, who was more skeptical of miracles and such things, would take a different approach from King James.
For sure, for sure.
But I'll close out the treatise, the pamphlet, with the last paragraph here. We haven't read the whole thing, but I think we touched upon all the main points that King James was making. So here we go. But craving at God and hoping that God shall continue his blessing with us in not sending such fearful desolation, I heartily wish our king's behavior so to be and continue among us as our God in earth and loving Father, endued with such properties as I described a king in the first part of the treatise, where he's talking about the duties of the king. And that ye, my dear countrymen and charitable readers, may press by all means to procure the prosperity and welfare of your king, that as he must on the one part think all his earthly felicity and happiness grounded upon your wellness, caring more for himself for your sake then for his own, thinking himself only ordained for your wellness, such holy and happy emulation may arise between him and you as his care for your quietness and your care for his honor and preservation may in all your actions daily strive together that the land may think themselves blessed with such a king, and the king may think himself most happy in ruling over so loving and obedient subjects. The end. Of course, finis in Latin there, but
It's the mic drop.
yeah, the mic drop. King James in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I think that while he goes into some darker areas and he is very clear about his concern about rebellions and such things, I think that he does have a very positive tone in a large number of places, and I think he wants to emphasize the benevolence of the king and also the duties of a king, and so at the end he does call back to the beginning part where he talks about how a king should behave, and I think calling back on that instead of ending with "and if you do rebel, I'm going to hang you all" or something, does show that he is not interested in presenting a fearful face to the people in that sense.
Right. He, like we've mentioned numerous times, he. Okay, let's put this. He puts back the focus as you mentioned, but he also still emphasizes the fact that he knows his role as king, and you should know your role as people. I think he kind of refers back to that, and it is a much happier way. I also agree with that. But one thing I want to bring up is the factor that I think he wants to emphasize the factor even at the end that even if okay, let's put this, he wants to emphasize the factor that he is under God's judgment as well. And I think that that's important because especially at that time, many people were religious or at least appeared to be more devoutly religious than you could say people today. Now, I'm not going to argue with that, but in general, when people view the society, they see it as a more religious society. So I think that he has that crowd going for him at the time of the writing. But even looking at it back now, I think that he, even at the very end, wants the people to go away knowing that, look, I'm even bound to God's judgment.
Yeah, I think that is an important emphasis here because and as we said earlier, it is something that obviously for religious grounds some people might disagree with, but within the context of that religious viewpoint, it does indeed mean that he carries a huge responsibility.
Right. And he seems to acknowledge that he does.
Yeah. So anyway, I would say that the points he made, and this is my final statement on this. The points he made throughout, I think were all pretty solid points. He made a few minor mistakes here and there, particularly when we talk about the history. But I think that based on what he is using for his arguments, that all his main arguments are actually pretty sound.
And for what I'll conclude with, we all know, especially for this time period, that they believed in divine rights. James the First pretty much states that, as we mentioned already. I do think that he tends to to value the people a lot more in the writing of this document, but he ultimately goes away with saying that God is the ultimate judge, meaning that he's still bound to God's judgment. But I still think that he could potentially use that as a way to avoid situations.
Yes, and that is the reason why I, for one, am not supportive of the idea of having the monarchies that exist today be the ideal forms of government. I think that there are better ways to organize a government than a fallible monarchy. And as such, that is what I strive for. So I want to emphasize here that in the case of Christ, and full disclosure here, I am a Christian. In the case of Christ, I am a monarchist for Christ, but I'm not necessarily a monarchist for anyone else. So, well, if I were to be born in a monarchy, I would be a loyal subject. I think that there are better forms of government based on the abilities that people have in this world.
Right. I think if God came down and had to make a government, it probably wouldn't be a monarchy.
Well, if God came down and had to make a government, he would rule himself as a monarch. That is one point where I
That is
agree
true, yeah.
with James there, that the that the rule of God is an absolute monarchy. Although I wouldn't agree that it would be perhaps the best way for more fallible beings to rule, though. Although I will say that it is a legitimate way to organize a country, and that I think the crowning of Saul and David and others is also legitimate and righteous. I just think that if we had to pick a government and we don't have a perfect person to lead us, I wouldn't want a monarchy. Now, I understand that there are people that disagree. I understand that there are monarchists out there that do think that a monarchy is the best government in all cases. I just happen to disagree on that point.
Right, that makes sense, yeah.
But anyway, let's close out here, unless you have anything more to say on the topic.
No, I got all my statements cleared out.
Okay. So next week, we will be moving to your channel once again as we alternate, just like last week's episode is on your channel. Last week's episode was on sovereign citizens, and the week before, we talked about the trial of King Charles, an event that where we see the ideas of King James here being put against ideas of popular sovereignty in a bit of a preface to what happens here at the Declaration of Independence. So an important historical event.
Yes, for sure. And just to let everybody know, if you do have ideas for us, you can always let us know in the comment section on Anavultus channel or my channel, and we will be more than willing to look at it and potentially go over one of your topics.
Yes, and in addition to that, if you'd like to read more on political philosophy, I have a book, Actionable Justice. You can find it on Amazon Kindle or perhaps on Taurus Necris. So Amazon Kindle for an ebook, Taurus Necris for a physical copy. So thank you all for watching, and we will be seeing you all next time. Our beautiful audience. Anavultus over and out.